I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island the people here today. So welcome to this webinar today with Energetics, Dexus and Darebin Council in collaboration with Business Renewable Centre. We do have a jam-packed webinar, so I'll just keep this introduction short. We're excited to collaborate with Energetics for this webinar, and we're excited to hear Anita and Matt, and also from Rob Sims from Dexus, Hugh Butcher from Darebin Council, on their recent experience establishing PPAs for their organisations. We'll have 20 to 30 minutes of presentations from Energetics, Rob and Hugh, and then go into a Q&A. You can type your questions in the Q&A area if you have one. I presume most of you know BRC-A, so I'll keep this introduction brief. The Business Renewables Centre Australia is an industry and government-funded member-based platform operated by Climate Kick, WWF, and UTS Institute for Sustainable Futures. I'm one of the technical directors through my role at ISF. We support corporates in navigating from start to finish of going for renewable power purchase agreements through boot camps, tools, primers via online platform, as well as events like this. This webinar comes at an excellent time. When corporate PPAs first kicked off in 2000 in Australia, it was at a time of high electricity prices and high renewable energy certificate prices, and the majority of deals were wholesale PPAs direct from corporate to wind and solar farm. However, Australians love to innovate, and we quickly saw new models come, and this includes retail PPAs, which sees the corporate sign long-term retail agreements with a retailer, directly by a wind or solar farm or from a portfolio of that retailer's projects. This has opened up corporate PPAs to a greater variety of corporates and buyers, including smaller buyers, although it's less able to sign derivative style contracts like wholesale PPAs. It also means that renewable energy developers and investors have an additional channel to market for their projects. We're going to hear from Anita, Matt, Hugh, and Rob on their PPAs. They kind of relate to Snowy Hydro and CleanCo and Iberdrola and the other variety of retailers providing these sorts of deals. I just thought I'd reflect quickly on some of the projects that like Snowy have supported. They've got wind and solar PPAs adding up to 888 megawatts, including with Clenergy's Metz Solar Farm, FRV's Goonumbla, and Res and Macquarie's Murrawara Wind Farm, and CWP and Tilt's Dundonald Wind Farm as well in Victoria. CleanCo have recently signed lots of PPAs, or very large ones at least, with the 1 gigawatt McIntyre Wind Farm and the 400 megawatt Southern Downs Solar Farm, and Iberdrola, who acquired Infigen a couple of years ago, owning and operating the Cherry Tree Wind Farm and with PPAs with Collector and Bogandora Wind Farm. So whilst these deals are with retailers, they really align with corporate PPAs supporting new wind and solar projects. Now I'd like to hand over to Anita from Energetics. She's a great supporter of the Business Renewable Centre and involved in many of the deals and projects with clients and getting more PPAs deals done. So,
thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you all for joining us today. I think I'm particularly pleased to have Hugh and Rob with us, who recently concluded retail intermediated PPAs in rather challenging kind of circumstances. Most of you probably know Energetics, and so I won't spend a lot of time introducing us, but Matt, if you can go to the next slide, please. I think it's, we're going to be talking today about renewable energy transactions, but I think Energetics, for those of you that don't know, provide a much wider suite of services, very much related to this particular space. And for many organizations that we support with net zero emission strategies, corporate PPAs are an important wedge in that journey to net zero. We also provide services to the supply side and have worked with many generators and investors in understanding the Australian market. We support a lot of our analysis in that space with for product development and portfolio optimization using our own in-house electricity price forecasting, which is also used to evaluate the services that the offers that we receive for both financial and retail intermediated PPAs. In addition to that, we provide work with strategies for organizations to deal with climate risk and developing resilience and strategies and adaptation strategies, ranging from infrastructure companies, banks, and super funds. We also do short-term electricity procurement contracts, much more sophisticated, progressive purchasing and structured arrangement, obviously, and then reporting services as well. But let's leave that there and look at what we're going to be talking about today. I'll provide a very brief update on the PPA market, some of the market risks that we're trying to manage through retail intermediated PPAs, and that then provide for an opportunity to do a bit of a deep dive into the Victorian Energy Collaboration, the 46 councils that Hugh will talk about, and Dexus, and how they've actually designed their solutions to really deal with some of these risks within the risk tolerance levels of their organizations. So talking about the market update, I think we know that 2020 was a significant year for PPAs, the corporate, and when we say corporate, I mean end user. So we typically don't track at this stage policy and wholesale PPAs, but of course the wholesale PPAs with retailers is what supports the retail intermediated PPAs. We don't have LGC only transactions on here at the moment, but if you just look at 2021 where we are right now, it's already stacking up to be the second best year since we started, the PPAs re-entered the Australian market. And there's many other transactions that we do know is in the pipeline, so we think that 2021 will be another great year. Since 2017, 50% of the transactions volume has been supported by heavy industry, manufacturing, and multi-sector buyer groups. So sometimes it's one sector, like in the case of VECO, but in other cases it could be multiple different sectors. Contract models, and Jonathan touched on it a little bit about the financial PPA or virtual PPAs, which is most common, the contract for difference type arrangements initially. Still account for around about 55% of the contract volume since 2017, but retail intermediated PPAs in 2017 accounted for about 4% of the volume. But if you now look at where we are sitting today, it's cumulatively accounting for 45%. So it's really taken up and showing significant demand. So if you look at why our organizations kind of contracting for PPAs, it really, back in 2017, and Matt, can you please change the slide? Back in 2017, it really was very much cost driven, I think, as Jonathan said, but increasingly it's become sustainability driven and particularly linked to corporates' commitment to manage climate risk and demonstrate concrete action to deal with the risk of climate change. That often lead to long-term emissions reduction targets. The moment organizations make these commitments, it's very hard to backtrack from those commitments without significant reputational damage. So the moment you make those commitments, you're exposing your organization to long-term carbon price risk. Now, you all would have probably heard recently in Europe, carbon pricing has sort of reached about $100 per ton, Australian dollars per ton equivalent. In Australia, many are forecasting a tripling of carbon pricing. And before everybody thinks that you want to go and charge those kind of numbers for your LGCs, of course, there's a carbon intensity kind of equivalent there, that the more renewables there's in the system, the less carbon content there will be per LGC. So that's to be kept in mind. However, the other thing to keep in mind is that when people are making commitments to net zero, for argument's sake, or RE100, you cannot just use carbon offsets to achieve those targets for scope 2 emissions. It's a requirement that you use energy attribute certificates, such as LGCs, to meet those commitments. So if you want to manage that carbon price risk, contracting long for LGCs could actually provide greater budget certainty. but you're still going to be sitting with the electricity market risk at a time when the market is entering unprecedented change. And that's where PPAs really come in, where it helps you to if it's well designed, to manage that long-term electricity market risk as the energy market transitions in the NEM. So even though we're saying that sustainability is the key driver, I've not worked with any organization where cost in the end has not become of paramount importance. And nobody's going to walk into a transaction knowing that it will be negative from a financial perspective. So potential cost benefits remain a key consideration. So looking at how the market is then, if you're not buying LGCs, which is very increasingly common, PPA buyers are very aware of the longer term market risks. And it's very clearly illustrated earlier this year when your lawn suddenly moved its retirement date 4 years forward. If you just add up the blue bubbles on this particular slide and you get to the early 2030s, you'll find that about 70% of the New South Wales generation fleet's expected to be retired. The pace is actually quite phenomenal, and we're actually moving very quickly towards that. And obviously, Liddell is just around the corner. But if you early in the year, when Dexus and VECO was concluding their transactions, energy prices were at multi-year lows. And at that stage, the likes of Origin and even the Energy Security Board just started sending strong signals and saying is that these lower prices, if they were to prevail, there will be much more capacity withdrawn from the market much quicker. So that is something that any corporate PPA buyer is very aware of, that we're sitting at the cusp of this significant transformation. And if you enter into a long-term agreement, and if it's well designed and considered, you can actually partially shield yourself against these risks. But if you go into to looking at any kind of electricity contracting, Matt, on the next slide, which Matt will really start touching on in specific context of VECO and Dexus, any electricity contract, whether it's black electricity contract, there's volume risk normally, and you all would be familiar with plus minus 20% vol flex that you get over a short-term contract. Pricing is typically peak and off peak to try and deal with the shape over that very short term. But you're also sitting with if and you'll see from the slides that Matt will show you now, is that whenever you go into the market to contract for power, you don't know whether that necessarily whether that's a low point in the market or a high point in the market. And you could easily kind of contract at a high point of the market for multiple years. But that's typically for a 3-year period. The moment you start talking about a longer term contract, you start amplifying some of these risks because there's greater uncertainty about your business requirements. You don't know what you're going to be doing from an energy efficiency, on-site renewables perspective. So these things add further risk from a management perspective. But then if you have a pricing model that exposes you to the profile and the volume generated by a renewable energy project potential, that could even be more exaggerated, that risk. So thinking carefully about managing that, thinking about if the market is very volatile, and if you think about the previous slide that I talked about, if these changes are happening, it will the likelihood of volatile periods are unfortunately, I think, quite high in the period going forward. So thinking about how do you manage that and not really locking in pricing, thinking you've got a crystal ball about what the future will hold. So careful design of your pricing models and your volume management models are therefore of utmost importance in the market that we are in. So I'll let Matt touch quickly on the conditions that Rob and Hugh sort of took the organisations to the market in.
Thank you, Anita. So this slide covers the Victorian futures market prices across Cal 21 to 24 for the period January 19 to October 2021. The red shaded area represents the time period in which contracts were in the market or being negotiated for VECO, and the green for Dexus, the red for VECO, green for Dexus. The brackets at the top of the page just represent the transaction support period for both. So noticeably, VECO support began in early 2019, and as Anita's mentioned, during the business case development, the market conditions were much different to the period the contracts were actually in the market. So looking back then, Victoria's reliance on sort of higher priced gas-powered generation, particularly in peak periods to meet demand, resulted in higher overall average spot prices. And this translated to higher expected future prices of around that $70 mark at that time. Australia's electricity market is also influenced by climate drivers. So at the beginning of 2020, an uncharacteristically mild summer and lower spot price volatility brought about by the La Nina or the cooling event resulted in a steady decline in futures prices. And that's quite evident from that period. We can see that across the Cal 21 and Cal 22 strips pictured. Furthermore, in March of 2020, when COVID-19 hit, we saw further reductions in operational demand, and this led to excess supply and lower fuel costs across the NEM. And this is particularly present during the period shaded for both VECO and Dexus when they were in the market. So it's fair to say that the combination of market events create a lot of noise and added complexity to the decision making at that time. During May 21, as the country emerged from the initial wave of COVID-19, operational demand began to return, as well as inflationary price drivers to the underlying fuel costs. So this is what we see on that tail end, where the expected futures prices rose across all contracts. So it's been a very dynamic market from January 19 to October 21, and this highlights the market risk of contracting at a particular point in time. So as Anita mentioned earlier, that time to market risk. And during periods of low futures prices, it challenged the drivers for a renewable PPA. So I'll demonstrate this a little bit further on the next slide. So again, we have now we have the Queensland futures market prices. So this applied solely to Dexus, but similar market factors influence Queensland over the same period of time that influenced Victoria that I just spoke about. However, in Queensland, we do have the additional tail end upward volatility, and this is a result of the unexpected explosion at Callide Power Plant, removing significant generation from the state. And this resulted in extreme spikes in spot prices and translated to clearly higher futures prices. Given the aging thermal generation fleet, this incident should not be viewed as isolated. And in fact, there's systemic issues across the NEM the buyers should be aware of moving forward towards 2030. And this was sort of highlighted in Anita's slide where we looked at the transition of aging thermal coal. This also then highlights, again, that time to market risk that we've mentioned. So time the lows versus the highs, given the unpredictability. During the contracting period, so when they're in the market, prices were at multi-year lows. And so there was also that temptation to lock in cheap black power prices and defer longer term commitments. Ultimately, the decision making came back to that potential long-term benefit of the PPA in rising and falling markets and the underlying corporate drivers. And so we should probably compliment both Dexus and VECO, who took the time to invest and understand the market and to make that sort of best risk-weighted outcome for their organisations. So we'll unpack these a little more as I now hand over to Hugh Butcher, followed by Rob. But I'll hand over to you now, Hugh, to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about VECO, what you've achieved and why you set out to achieve it.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Anita, and also the BRC-A and Energetics more generally for having us today. So as Matt said, Darebin City Council was the lead organisation for the Victorian Energy Collaboration, or VECO, and very much where we started this journey was very much picked up on a lot of those commonalities and motivators that Anita and Matt sort of outlined. Back in 2017, we had lots of councils well, pretty much all councils on short-term contracts. We had renewable energy purchasing. If councils were doing this, it was an additional cost. It was seen as being really expensive, and we were on 2-year fixed price black power contracts. And often we were working with aggregators to secure these contracts. And we felt that we saw a lot in the marketplace. We heard about these sort of retail and financial PPAs being struck, and the concept of having a different approach to procurement around renewable energy was something that was really motivating, potentially for councils to go in a different direction. And we certainly did. And so we basically set up ourselves to, I guess, engage the entire sector here in Victoria and look at how we can do things differently. And we sort of, basically what we wanted to do is just wanted to create a new arrangement for councils to purchase renewable energy. And we wanted that to be initiated by councils as well, because we weren't getting the necessary sort of outcomes that we wanted through our typical arrangements. Just want to go to the next slide, thanks, Matt. So as Matt suggested, we went through a big journey, and this took us nearly 3 years to sort of land. And we actually went out and sought the engagement of every single council here in Victoria that didn't have a PPA at the time, and said, did they want to come on this journey with us? We were really sort of humbled by the fact that we got 46 councils to say, yeah, we want to be part of this. And Darebin was the lead organisation. And so what we did is we pulled our electricity together, and that amounted to about 240 gigawatt hours annually, I suppose. So we felt as though that we had a really big load, and we found out quite quickly that if we were to deliver this was going to be the largest ever sort of initiative by a local government in Australia ever. So it was quite a significant sort of opportunity, I suppose. And I guess one of the things to note within this sort of arrangement is that this is a buyers group. So there's a lot of sort of, I guess, nuances or compounding sort of things that need to be considered when you're working with a buyers group versus a customer that is just a single entity. And we did some quick maths, and we had something like 500 decision makers as part of this particular process. So quite a complex sort of array of people needs that we needed to address all along the way. Next slide, please, Matt. And so part of that process was understanding collectively what our project drivers were. And you can see through what we've got on the screen there that there's many different risks that we were trying to manage. And certainly, as Anita and others have said, is that, we needed this to be collectively no more than what we were currently paying for under our current arrangement. So that was a really important element that we needed to sort of establish as a group. We also had things like we needed to make sure that we had an offer for all of our types of accounts that we have. And the other thing as well that was really important was that the buyers group needed to receive the same kind of solution, the same benefit, no matter what type of council that was actually participating, whether small, large, or otherwise. Next slide, please, Matt. But as I said, on top of the project risks and things like that we need to understand and therefore position ourselves to get a solution, we as Darebin also had to think about some other things, and that was really the risk at the buyers group level. And when you're dealing with these types of things like the capacity of the buyers group is really important, anticipating that you need to increase that over time. Make sure that the project has momentum over time as well, and it doesn't waver and people will sort of lose interest or support. And then us as Darebin, as the lead organisation, we need to make sure that everyone had the trust and confidence in us to deliver something like this. And so everything from project management, procurement, and even how we govern ourselves and have some accountability from the other entities was really important as well. So we had to make sure that not only were we delivering on a technical perspective, but we also had sort of making sure that the administration and governance side of things was being delivered as well. Next slide, please, Matt. As Anita alluded to, we've got a retail deal with Red Energy as our retailer, and we're connected to two wind farms here in Western Victoria, being Dundonna Wind Farm and Marrawara Part 2. And one of the things that was really important is that everyone has their own individual contract under this arrangement, and it's exactly the same. And so we're purchasing both energy and LGCs as part of this and wrapping it up as a retail deal. And this is really important for us to make it sort of simple and as familiar as possible for all of our customers. Next slide, please, Matt. I just wanted to finish up on talking about a couple of the features. So our power price it has elements that are fixed. There's portions of it that are fixed, but also a variable component over time. And so we sort of reset that. We've also got a fixed price for LGCs. And over time, we've got some really sort of favourable sort of low flex provisions, which over a long period is really important for customers. And we've also got the ability for new councils to potentially sign on to the same deal in the future as well. And then lastly, just the last couple of other key features that are really sort of important were, as we said, we did the financial analysis. Our offer is cheaper than our BAU, our old arrangements over the same contract period. From a reputational perspective, we've actually really aligned ourselves what we think is a high quality projects that have got a social license to operate where they are. And from an administration perspective, we've got new levels of customer support along with KPIs that we've never really had before. And without going through this process, we never would have had these things. So we're really sort of glad that we went through this process. That's it from me. I might hand back to Matt now to talk about Rob and the next project. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Hugh, and what a fantastic outcome for the 46 councils of VECO. I'll now hand over to Rob Sims from Dexus to talk a little bit about the deal that they've done in Queensland and Victoria. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for the opportunity to join the webinar today. Just by introduction, I'm Rob Sims, and I'm the General Manager for Group Sustainability here at Dexus, and as part of my role, I chair our internal energy procurement working group. Just a very quick background on Dexus, for those that aren't familiar with us. Dexus is a top 50 ASX listed real estate investment trust, and we're one of Australia's fully integrated real estate groups. And we manage a high quality property portfolio valued at approximately $42.5 billion. Across that, we invest in properties in the office, retail, industrial and healthcare sectors. And at Dexus, we look to integrate sustainability across our platform as part of our sustainability approach. And as part of that, we seek to integrate the management of environmental impacts, looking at carbon emissions, as well as energy efficiency. And that's all in support of our key stakeholders, which are our investors and our customers. And they together help drive Dexus's purpose, which is to create spaces where people thrive. So we look at our real estate portfolio as an enabler for business and productivity and work and life. And we look to live that purpose by placing our customers at the centre of our thinking. Thanks, Matt. So as Anita mentioned, we've seen, I guess we're one of the organisations that's looked to bring the concept of managing both the operational aspects of energy procurement together with our ESG goals and environmental aspirations. So one of those key aspirations that we've set is to transition our managed portfolio to be net zero emissions. We originally set our goal out at 2030 in 2018, but recognising the increasing importance on taking strong and urgent action on climate, and also listening to the messages from our key stakeholders, our customers and investors. This year we advanced our target and we're looking to deliver net zero emissions in the coming year. Now, central to that goal is that formula that's on screen, which starts with optimising our portfolio through energy efficiency and managing water and waste impacts. But then once we optimise that, we still need to deal with the residual emissions associated with management. And around 80% of our operational emissions relates to electricity use, with the remaining 20% devoted to water, waste and refrigerants and natural gas usage. So targeting to target net zero emissions, managing our electricity supply and transitioning to 100% renewables was an imperative for us to meet this goal. Through this formula, we're looking to drive down emissions at source, rather than relying on offsets to deal with all of the emissions that we emit. And so again, transitioning to renewable supply allows us to move away from fossil fuel generation. So the setting of this goal was integral to the procurement that we're undertaking at the time, as Matt articulated in the earlier slides. So we had some very specific ESG drivers in our procurement. Firstly, there was the economic. We did want to make sure that we secured the forward supply. We obviously wanted to transition to an integrated arrangement in order to make it as simple and easy as we can for ourselves and for our customers. And as Anita mentioned earlier, we wanted to make sure that we were actively managing forward risk. And so we sat down with our internal stakeholders and with Energetic's assistance to help look at our key considerations in our design. And the three areas that I've got up here on this slide for us provided a very balanced view of how we wanted to go to the market. The first area was around stewardship. And unlike a manufacturer where electricity is essentially a cost of operations, Dexus in effect procures electricity on behalf of the customers in our buildings, because the vast bulk of that cost is passed through and shared amongst customers as part of their outgoings and the occupancy of the space. And so we do have a role in not only sourcing ethically and responsibly, but also making sure that we do that in a risk-managed way. And for that reason, a retail-linked PPA or driven PPA was more favourable to us than potentially going direct to a generator. The other thing around the stewardship was making sure that we were forward managing the cost and how we're procuring for price, but making sure we did have that firmed price to provide budget certainty to customers. So having some sort of spot linked or derivative based arrangement wasn't quite suitable for the Dexus environment. From an operational perspective, volume changes and being able to adapt to our changing portfolio was a key consideration. So we buy and sell buildings periodically. We are looking to, as we invest in further assets and develop further assets, our energy requirements increase. But conversely, as we look to incorporate energy efficiency, we're looking to drive down the amount of energy we're using. And so we have a dynamic, or some two forces that are pulling in opposite directions that we need to manage. And that can make it quite challenging if you're entering into a long-term contract with a fixed sort of vol-flex arrangement. And finally, as I mentioned, our ESG goals. Not only were we looking to deliver net zero emissions, but we want to make sure we can help enable our customers to reduce their emissions as an upstream supplier to them. And we also, a key consideration that we had in the design was that we wanted to show that we're making a tangible difference in the transition of Australia's energy sector. And so by direct investment and trying to help support the investment in new wind and solar projects was critical. So the way we went to market involved the structure that's on the right-hand side of the slide, which we've determined a fixed and flex structure, where we had a portion of our load that was fixed in price and in load, and then we used progressive purchasing techniques to fill the gap to 100% of our current needs. By doing so, we're able to forward manage the purchasing of that on the futures market, and we're able to ramp up or ramp down the variable component as we either buy properties or as we implement initiatives to reduce our energy needs. Thanks, Matt. And finally, just touching on the outcomes. So in addition to a PPA that we have in place already with Red Energy in New South Wales, similar to the arrangement that Hugh mentioned. Through this exercise, we entered into new PPAs in Queensland and Victoria. In Queensland, we entered into a 9.5-year agreement which is linked to two energy power plants that are under development with CleanCo, being the key off-taker there. And then in Victoria, we have entered into a 7.5-year PPA with Iberdrola Australia, linked to the Cherry Tree Wind Farm, which is currently in operation. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to everybody's questions and the conversation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob, for that. Excellent to hear that Dexus has brought forward that net zero commitment to FY22. So huge congratulations on that. And it's great to see that those PPAs are helping in that journey by reducing your scope 2 emissions, and that you're also bringing your customers along for the ride. So hopefully now, having sort of listened to Rob and Hugh, you can start to see the outcomes of these transactions resulted in very bespoke arrangements to meet their needs and their drivers. I might just throw to you now, Hugh. How did your team ensure that the solution was the right one for councils?
Thanks, Matt. I guess one of the things that we needed to do as a customer is to realise that there needs to be a balance between sort of over or under prescribing when you go to market. Part of that is actually starting a journey and understanding what your risk profile is, and moving and translating that into, I suppose, specifications that you put out. But I think that there's a risk sometimes of under prescribing and expecting the market to understand your need, and vice versa, over prescribing and saying this is exactly what we need and needs to be X, Y, and Z, and have no flexibility. So I think part of it for us was understanding what was really important to us, and then allowing a bit more flexibility outside of those parameters, which were sort of must-haves, I suppose, and allowing the retailers to and the market to really sort of identify where they think they could add value to this transaction. And I think that our particular deal is reflective of that. So some of those elements that we identified were very much must-haves, but other features of it were actually brought to the table by the retailer. And I think that that's really important. The other thing, as well, as a customer, I think it's really important to think about how flexible you are in certain elements. And part of our journey, we also not only just did our own homework with a business case, but we actually did some market testing along the way. So we were making sure that us as a buyers group was seen as attractive in the marketplace early on, and made sure that we weren't heading in a direction where we wouldn't necessarily get the outcome that we wanted to achieve.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Hugh. And yeah, certainly that sort of evolution through the stages of taking on or knowing what you wanted and then allowing the market to innovate was a delicate balance, but it seems like you got it pretty right in the end. Maybe over to you then, Rob. Did the market come up with the solution, or did you sort of specify up front what you needed?
So we actually leveraged the experience that we had negotiating our original agreement with Red Energy. So we've been working on this ever since 2016, when we went to market and ended up with a standard procurement arrangement that transitioned towards a progressive arrangement. That really set the scene for us to move from what I would determine to be passive energy management to more active procurement techniques. As we start to see our portfolio change, we started to see how all these different risk elements and procurement requirements were starting to emerge. Then once we added the renewable layer in, we were able to combine that together. And to their credit, Red helped us shape what that looked like, and we'd like to think we helped them bring their product to market. And we found that was a really good fit for both parties. It provided the right level of flexibility for us. There was enough proactive management without it being too onerous. And we were able to then sort of leverage the style of that and replicate that when we went to market with this current round.
Yeah, great. So it's fair to say that your past experience allowed you to somewhat narrow down what you wanted from the start to the market, and gave them a pretty good briefing on what you required and how you wanted to set the tone.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and certainly, obviously working with energetics over this time as well, just to help leverage some of the experiences and perhaps some of the structures that were being negotiated through other retailers. We did take that opportunity to sense check and fine tune what we've done in this round.
Yeah, fantastic. I guess the next one would be that given the Dexus sort of business model of investing and divesting in assets, and even VECO's operational requirements from sort of a large number of councils, maybe back to you again, Rob, one of your key design considerations required adapting to portfolio change, and you sort of touched on that a little earlier in your slides. Can you explain how this mechanism will support growth and reduction in your load over time?
Certainly. So what we've effectively looked at as part of so positioning ourselves over the next up to 10 years, we looked at what would be the minimum we would need if we didn't undergo any increases in the portfolio, but we continued to invest in energy efficiency, and that sort of set a very minimum hurdle about what we could commit to from a procurement perspective. And that has helped us set the base load, which has given us a hedge against price volatility, and it's also locked in that generation source linkage that we were looking for. But from the experiences that we've garnered from the progressive purchasing, it's allowed us to be a lot more agile with how we set quarterly volumes and then how we procure those volumes. So from a procurement perspective, we're monitoring the market as part of our procurement working group, and then we're able to progressively purchase up to our quota as we have either time triggers or volume triggers or market opportunities. But as we see new portfolios coming in or new or potential divestments being announced internally, we're able to then work with our retailer to forward manage what the load book looks like. So we're not exposing ourselves to a fixed quantity or a fixed term over such a long term, which in our given what's happening with Dexus and how agile we are, just does not suit our needs.
Yeah, great. And then, with that investing and divesting, you have that flexibility on sort of what you do or don't purchase longer term. And then on the aggregate load, you still have your sort of traditional volume flex parameters. So you sort of safeguard yourself as a business who could be open to large swings in volume. So quite a neat arrangement there. Hugh, to some extent, you also face some similar challenges with changing operational requirements of councils. Do you just want to explain a little bit how your deal evolved to deal with that?
Yeah, and I think that similar to the what I was saying before, in order to get to the stage where we can actually talk about what our requirements are, it's first off understanding those requirements and understanding those nuances between all of the different parties and the different councils that we've got as part of our group. And I think that that sort of process of understanding how we manage our assets, how they come in and out of the portfolio was really important. So that when we went to market, we were very clear around the expectations around how they were to be managed by the retailer. And I think that, as I said in the previous sort of discussion around, being flexible enough to allow for innovation or allow for sort of favourable terms, but to really work out what's really important. So for us, it was really important that councils could add and sort of take out accounts over time as part of normal operations, because we have, similar to Rob's, we've got 5,500 accounts, I think, as part of our deal cumulatively. And so we've got accounts going in and out all the time. So to be able to have that provision in there to allow for that is really important. But from a volume perspective as well, is that we thought that there was also a value proposition in collectively having a customer group like us there. So, and having that over the long term for the retailer. So we also tried to sort of, I guess, not necessarily innovate, but to push the retailers to think about what that means to them and how they can actually bring something back to the customer group. So in the end, we've got a really favourable low flex provision around volume, which allows for a lot of that, not only sort of the pluses and minuses with accounts coming in and out, but the actual volume to change over time. And I think that part of that is definitely the retailer coming to the party and saying, yes, we want to provide you with that. But it's also around the customer understanding what that need is in the first instance as a group and being able to say, this is what we need. And so I think that, yeah, it's one of the things that we needed to change in our group over time, and I'm glad we did, is to stop thinking about this as a one-way street. These deals are a two-way partnership and collaboration in some respect, and being able to understand where you're willing to move and vice versa is really important. Getting long-term deals that you're happy with, and also the decision makers of your organisation.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, we do see these new arrangements as long-term partnerships, and yeah, certainly the long track record we've had with Red prior to this has demonstrated there is ebb and flow that needs to be considered, and part of the decision making that we had around the choice of our retailer was, that counterparty and the service levels they could provide, the flexibility, how they were going to help enable us, as well as the commercials.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Robin. You really touched there, I think, on that element of risk sharing between the retailer and the organisation, and how you determine what's palatable for both parties, whilst to some degree still getting what you need, and both of you have clearly the operational requirements and change in load over time were key considerations, and you found palatable outcomes. So that's a really good result. I think now we'll maybe head back to you, Jonathan or Anita. We're going to take some questions, I understand, and do a bit of Q&A.
Thanks so much, Matt. It was great to hear those presentations and the discussion after. Fantastic. So there's a lot of audience questions. We'll try and get to all of them, but we've only got 10 minutes. So Hugh and Rob and Matt and Anita, if you wanted to answer any of them in text in the meantime. One question that took my attention was relating to Anita and her slide, how some of these PPAs were signed when pricing, the ASX baseload futures pricing was quite low. It made me think that someone once told me the market is driven by fear and greed. So low prices to me would suggest that there may be less corporate PPAs for a period. But what you're highlighting is it can be a great time to buy. And I guess the expectations from the retailers and the generators could be at lower pricing during those lower pricing times. Whether it's rational or not, or emotional, is another question. But the question was around, as prices have rebounded a little bit, would corporate PPA buyers be best off waiting till April next year, or how to sort of manage that timing?
If I can take this answer, I suppose if there's one thing that both the VECO and Dexus transactions has illustrated, is that the need to look beyond the near term. If you want to enter into a power purchase agreement transaction, it's a risk management instrument. It's not a way to actually guarantee you a given financial outcome relative to the market. So I would say, continue with your processes. These transactions take a fair amount of time to complete. And I think, as both Rob and Hugh has illustrated, it requires significant investment in time to make sure that you familiarize yourself with the market and think carefully about how do you design your requirements so that you can manage your risk in the longer term operationally and from a market perspective.
So you kind of separate yourself from that day-to-day trading numbers and look long-term and plan long-term. And a question that I had was around the pricing models in these PPAs. How do they manage that risk? Anita, would you like to answer, or happy to hear from Rob, Matt, or Hugh as well?
I think, for what I think both organizations kind of managed, I think, two things very well. It's the long-term price uncertainty. They've have been taken into account. None of them have actually locked in fixed pricing for the full term, for the full load. I think there was a realization that they needed to leave themselves exposed to the market to deal with the event of potential lower prices into the future, but to give themselves an anchor as well to actually shield themselves against pricing moving up. I think they both dealt with time to market risk in a way, whereas in VECO price model, there's a mechanism that doesn't actually lock in the variable portion based on a given price of a future price, a future market delivered electricity on a given day. And I wouldn't, there's obviously certain confidentiality around the pricing model design, but just noting that the retailer came up with an innovative mechanism that dealt with that time to market risk. Whereas Rob has adopted a mechanism of progressive purchasing to manage that time to market risk on a portion of his load, so that he doesn't actually expose himself to that same extent. And I think so there's ways in which I think there's actually an interesting case study which Red has approved for us to release on the pricing model on our website for VECO, that speaks a little bit about the pricing model and how there's actually been some protection given even on the variable portion in terms of how pricing may move. And that all comes down to innovation that from the retailers. And I think that's what we're inviting all the time. And I know that there's a lot of retailers on the market, on the call here today as well. And it really is about trying to understand the customer's problem and come up with innovative solutions, because they're all sitting with the same problem: time to market risk and long-term uncertainty in electricity prices, but wanting to also capture the benefit of committing long-term and wanting some of that kind of budget certainty to come through and that connection to projects. So I hope that answers on a principle level what I think both organizations achieved, but I'm sure Rob and Hugh, you could add some more if you like.
Yeah, particularly Hugh. Someone asked this directly of you in the Q&A. So do you have anything to add to Anita's comments in terms of pricing model and fixed and variable components?
Yeah, look, I mean, with our deal, part of it was acknowledging that you can't completely, control or hedge risks. You need to manage them. So, one of the phrases that someone else coined in our group is like, there's no silver bullet, but there might be a silver buckshot in there somewhere. So this is one of, like, our variable and fixed component is one of many different things that part of our deal that manages risk. And it's similar to what Anita was saying, that you need to take a longer term view on these types of things. Now, we don't know what the future holds, but are we comfortable that we've got a reasonable approach to managing that risk in the future? And is it transparent? Is it repeatable? And or does it go into a black box and we hope that we get a good answer to come out of it? And I think that those types of thought processes where you haven't necessarily got an answer to in terms of saying the number is going to be this, I think that you need to be confident in the structure that forms that number in the end of the day. And as long as you're confident that that represents, an adequate representation of your risk profile, then it should actually meet your needs. So I think that it's understanding what that need is from your perspective as a customer, and then being able to say what's being proposed, does that actually meet that? And part of that is actually having that help along the way to be able to interpret some of these really complex things that are, from a customer's point of view, we don't want to necessarily be project specialists and understand the market to the nth degree, but we want to be able to go in partnership with someone that does and can help us interpret what that means in a at a very granular level, I suppose. And that's really important, I think.
Great, thanks Hugh. Rob, if you had any further comments, and also there was a question for you. Great work leading Dexus's transition, I concur. I noticed you had offtake terms of under 10 years. What was the reason for this? And was it difficult to find direct offtakes for sub 10-year terms? I'd be interested to hear in your tenders where you specified limits or targets or anything like that, or you kind of molded, you let the sort of market present to you what they could do and you molded your decision around that?
Yeah, good question. So when we did our initial red deal, well, I guess early in the conversations about PPAs, either generators or even retailers would come to us and say, look, we need 10 years, 15 years. And at the time, our business was dealing in 1 to 3 year fixed term contracts. So making that leap to I guess, locking in something quite rigidly for 10 years was a real challenge for Dexus because of that need to maintain the agility. So that's where we came up with this fixed and flexed design structure. And Red were able to come to the party to talk in a 7-year term at that time, because they knew that they were building a portfolio that was just beyond Dexus. So that we helped see that portfolio, but we knew that they could see the future and were investing in it steadfastly. So I think that's where there was a little bit of meeting in the middle. When we then went out for Victoria, we would have probably gone longer, but our current contract doesn't end till June 23. So we've actually contracted 2 years ahead of time for this PPA, and we've extended that out to the end of the RET. And then because our Queensland portfolio was coming up at the end of June, just gone, we took the opportunity to go out 9.5 years, again, to align with the retirement of the RET. And for us, that was just an appropriate milestone. As an industry, there's been a lot of talk about 2030 as a key sort of carbon milestone. And then we felt, well, we might as well just stretch a little bit and deal with the RET and understand what's the future of an LGC going to look like in the next iteration. So for us, there was that element of neatness and completeness. But having said that, the challenges in the procurement, some respondents said, look, we don't have an offtake today. We're commissioning a plant, or we've got a plant that's under construction. How do we deal with that? And so we built mechanisms into our contract whereby if there's a project delay risk, we specified a hierarchy of LGCs that they need to source to fill the gap, ideally from their portfolio. But we had a hierarchy based on the generation technologies that we wanted to focus on, which for us is wind and solar. We definitely wanted to target green power accredited power stations. And we're also looking for alignment from a jurisdictional perspective. So we wanted to make sure that if our Queensland portfolio, it's investing in Queensland projects. And for us, that was a demonstrable way for our internal stakeholders to show that we're making a difference in the markets in which we operate.
Fantastic. So got a couple more questions, but I think we got to most of the ones purely on this topic of retail PPAs and purchasing models. Anita or Matt, did you have any closing comments before I wrap up?
I think just to maybe add that I think this is a very dynamic market. I think as you can see that it's very active at the moment. I think there's for those organisations looking to meet their carbon reduction targets, I think there's increasingly innovative and exciting products available to the market. But I think also on the financial PPA side, I think there's for organisations that's able to kind of wear the risks associated with derivative products and take exposure to spot market. I think there's fantastic opportunities to be explored there as well, with increasingly sort of structured products emerging in that space as well, to look at different risk transfer arrangements between buyers and sellers. So I think it's a very effective instrument, PPAs, to deal with long-term electricity market as well as carbon risk. But I think what you hopefully learned today is that a lot of careful planning is needed up front, and considered engagement with the market to really ensure that you in the end design solutions that comes up with an appropriate risk distribution between the seller and the buyer. That's the win-win situation for all in the long run.
Thanks so much, Anita. It can be a real challenge for corporates to come and speak publicly about these deals. These deals can be tricky and come with their complexities and can be sensitive topic. So we really appreciate Rob and Hugh coming and presenting on their deals today, and really appreciate Matt and Anita hosting this and also collaborating with BRC-A to set up this webinar. I've just posted a link. I should say, Anita, would you like to, you did mention that prior that you're happy to take any questions directly. Would you like to put your email address in there, or direct in the chat, or direct people where they can, how they can get in touch with Energetics?
Yeah, as I said, yeah, it's a bit difficult to always answer the questions live, so I'll put my email address there, and I promise to answer them if you're flicking to me.
Give Anita time, she'll get there, but she's very busy as well. But again, thanks so much for Energetics to collaborating with us to set up this webinar, and thank you to all the attendees that came. I posted our website link into the chat, and so keep an eye there in our events and webinar section for updates from us, or sign up to our mailing list. And also we'll put up the slides from today and a recording from today's webinar. So that's a wrap. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a good rest of this short week and a fantastic Wednesday. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.